Tensions in the Middle East have been simmering for quite some time, predating, of course, even the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October. But then came the assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh. And now nations from around the globe are battling to prevent the tension transforming into something much, much worse. Haniyeh was assassinated by an explosive device smuggled into his guest house in Tehran, Israel presumably responsible. That led the Iranians and Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed militia in Lebanon, to pledge retaliation. And military drills suggest something might just be imminent. So now, a frenzy of diplomacy and a significant upscaling of the US military presence in the region, including a carrier group and a submarine. And don't forget, those peace talks still ongoing between Israel and Hamas. Let's try to get to grips with what's really going on. I'm Niall Paterson. This is the Sky News Daily. Alistair Bunkall is Sky's Middle East correspondent. Michael Clarke is our defence analyst. You first, Ali. Look, tensions in the region between Israel and Iran are clearly nothing new, but this does have a feel of a different order, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does feel different. Before October the 7th, there was something called some mutual deterrence that existed, which essentially meant that the two sides were deterred from attacking one another. The feeling now, particularly in Tehran, after the killing of Ismail Haniyeh, but also Israel killing a senior IRGC, that's the Revolutionary Guard commander in Damascus back in April, the feeling in Tehran is that Israel is no longer scared to carry out major attacks in Iran. And so that is driving their desire for some sort of response to try and restore that deterrence.
I mean, Michael, no longer scared, but are we at a point now where Israel needs to be fearful of an Iranian attack, or once again are we seeing brinksmanship of the likes of which we have seen in the past?
In a way, both sides are trying to re-establish deterrence. So, the Israelis have attacked Tehran directly when they killed Haniyeh, right in the presidential compound. That was a big message. And the Iranians feel we've got to re-establish deterrence. And the Israelis think that following the attack on the Damascus consulate on the 1st of April, and then this big incoming attack on the 13th of April, all these 350-odd missiles and drones that were then fired at Israel, directly at Israel, they have to re-establish deterrence because they don't want the Iranians to feel that they can attack Israel directly. So both sides here have suffered vulnerabilities, which is one of the things that makes the events that are going to happen almost inevitable.
Ali, I mean, do you share that sense of inevitability? Isn't there, a body of opinion right now, and valid opinion, that to an extent Israel has invited an attack upon itself by Iran?
Well, I do share the sense of inevitability, and that's certainly what we're hearing in private as well, is that there is a determination to carry out some sort of retaliation, although we don't necessarily know how that will look. Looking at April, as Michael said, when there was about 350 drones and missiles fired at Israel by Iran, we're looking at that as a precedent. There are alternatives. I think probably we are looking at some sort of major missile attacks, certainly by Hezbollah on Israel and probably by Iran. There is an off-ramp if they want it, and they could wait and see what the outcome of the ceasefire talks that are due to take place on Thursday are, because if they progress in the right direction, and if the two sides, that's Hamas and Israel, did agree a ceasefire, then I think that would give cover for Hezbollah and Iran to back off a bit.
Michael, that is the mood music in the region right now, the kind of the build up to where we are. But in terms of specifics, what indications have there been from Iran that an attack may well be imminent?
Well, there's a lot of preparations that have been reported. Iranian-backed militias and IRGC-backed militias, the Iranian Republican Guard Corps, militias in Iraq moving toward US bases right on the border, over the border, in fact, in Syria. Quite a lot of rocket launchers have been seen moving across the Levant to position themselves. Now, that might be a bluff, or it might be preparations which are not then carried through. They may not, as it were, press the button when they've got everything in place. But undoubtedly, the Iranians are looking at preparing for some sort of multi-front gesture, which will probably come from Hezbollah in Lebanon, from them directly, from Iraqi groups, and probably from the Houthis in Yemen further south. Because, Israel is surrounded in a sort of semicircle of enemies. And I suspect that if they do that, they'll also accompany in it, so as not to look as if it's just April the 13th all over again. They'll do something different and novel, which will actually be distracting and show that they've got lots of other strings to their bows.
If the decision is taken to launch an attack against Israel, who makes that decision?
I think you have sort of three key voices here. You've got the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, who is they're the arm of the Iranian military that was set up following the 1979 revolution to protect the supreme leader, essentially. And they, through their what's known as their Quds Force, are tasked with foreign operations. They're the ones who manage, put it like that, the proxies around the region. They are also tend to be far more hawkish. Another voice is the Iranian president, who is newly elected. It was at his inauguration that Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated. He is seen as more of a moderate. Long term, he wants to sort of rebuild some of the ties with the West. Apparently, he is cautioning against a major attack. But it all comes down, everything in Iran comes down to the word of the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. And he has previously, in the last week and a half, said that Iran should attack Israel directly. Now, just quickly looking at Hezbollah, they are Iran's biggest, best funded, best armed, most experienced proxy. And so the links are very, very close. Although Iran and Hezbollah will try and tell you that Hezbollah operates somewhat independently. It's free to make its own decisions through Hassan Nasrallah, its leader. They're not going to operate entirely independently, but they might not necessarily do things in coordination with Iran.
I mean, Michael, certainly we know that other international players are taking the situation very, very seriously indeed. Walk us through what the United States is doing in the region at the moment, because we know that a carrier group, and you'll explain what that is on its way and is being hurried on its way by the United States. But also we've been told about a submarine being moved into the region as well.
The political track is that they're working the phones very hard and they're working their diplomats very hard in all of the capitals to make it clear that the United States is watching very carefully and cool it, guys. That's what they're saying to everybody. They're backing that up with this military lesson. And the military is both to deter the Iranians, to say, look, if you think you can attack American bases as a way of distracting from your attack on Israel, think again. I did a little tot-up only a few days ago. And by my reckoning, they've got one carrier there, one assault ship there. They've got 10 different frigates and destroyers and 16 support ships all moving around in the area. And they're about to be joined by another carrier battle group, which will carry another half a dozen support ships and frigates and destroyers, plus all of the 60-odd aircraft that they have on board. As to the submarine, carry Tomahawk cruise missiles. To say that they've got one in the area is telling everybody that, look, we can launch a barrage of Tomahawk cruise missiles and we can do it from anywhere we like in the whole area. Advertising is interesting. There's a ship in the area called the MV Ocean Trader. It's a support ship, a command ship for US Special Forces, the Delta Force, the SEALs, and it carries a lot of stuff on board. They're not advertising it, but it's public knowledge.
But Michael, that is a hell of a lot of incredibly sophisticated kit, incredibly well-skilled, members of the US military and special forces, as you've just mentioned, tons of aircraft to be brought to bear. I mean, are the Americans genuinely saying to Iran, if you do this, we will hit you?
Absolutely. Or that we have the power both to defend at the territory we want to defend in the area with our missile defences on these destroyers. They're called Arleigh Burke class destroyers, they're very powerful air defence destroyers. And they've had them in the Red Sea for a while against the Houthis. So we're saying we can defend ourselves with aircraft, and we can hit you with aircraft.
Michael, Ali, let's pause just for a moment. When we come back, we'll discuss what might yet stop the hawks in Iran and Lebanon from acting on their threats and the conflict from spreading. Stay there. Welcome back. Our Middle East correspondent Alistair Bunkall, our defence analyst Michael Clarke, still with us. And we really need to kind of focus, I suppose now, Alistair, on whether or not this situation is preventable. Already we are seeing a furious diplomatic effort. I mean, the US Secretary of State, US Foreign Secretary in essence, Antony Blinken, is calling it a period of intense diplomacy. We've seen European leaders calling for calm. Does any of this stuff work? Does any of it get through? Or is it just merely putting in the public domain that which they are saying through the diplomatic channels in private?
It's hard to know because if something quite big happens and you think, oh, look, diplomacy's failed, so much for what the White House was trying to achieve, they haven't achieved it. What you don't know is whether or not they have talked, whether it's Israel or Iran or whoever, down from an even higher platform, if you like. I think in the last 10 and a half months, there have been many, many times where the Americans have tried to use their influence over, in particular, the Israelis. And there have certainly been examples where they have achieved that, maybe not as quickly as they would have hoped, but there have also been many examples where the Israelis have appeared to just ignore what their American allies have had to say. And a lot of people will sit and argue that the Americans are the biggest military donors to Israel, and they are providing Israel with weapons, and all they need to do is cut off that supply line and it would bring a war to a very swift end. I think that's a little simplistic, particularly in a US election year when you have a very divided constituency in the United States between people who are deeply pro-Palestinian and want this war to come to an end. We've seen them interrupt Kamala Harris's speeches in recent days, for example, and then you've got a very strong and powerful pro-Israel lobby as well. And so I don't think that route is straightforward for Biden to take with the election looming. I think the Americans, I know the Americans, I've been speaking to them a lot, are very, very frustrated by what they have and haven't been able to achieve. But they hope that they can use their levers in order to try and bring some cool to the current situation.
Michael, your thoughts on that topic? I mean, we should bear in mind, we have seen a joint statement from the British Prime Minister, the French President, the German Chancellor, calling on Iran to halt the hostilities, to refrain from retaliatory action. As Alistair was talking about there, we have seen Blinken jetting around about the region, spending most of his time presumably speaking to any of the key players that he can get hold of. But again, I mean, does the United States have any sway over the decision-making that will be taking place in Tehran and in Lebanon?
So US policy has an effect on them. They can't ignore it. They can ignore the West Europeans a bit more, and they certainly more or less ignore anything the British say. They sort of listen politely, but then they glaze over. And they, in a way, that all this crisis since the 7th of October has demonstrated more dramatically what's been happening more over a longer period. It's the decline of Western influence across the Levant and the Middle East. And there's a sort of great power vacuum in the Middle East, which Russia and China are steadily moving in to try to fill, plus the growth of regional dynamics. So the Saudis are more influential now than they ever were before. The Iranians are more influential with their clients than they ever were before. And even small players like the United Arab Emirates and Qatar, a tiny player, they try to exert their influence in different ways, sometimes usefully, sometimes a bit less usefully. It's a region that works on its own dynamics with different external powers. And the United States, the limitation on US power has been really incredibly dramatically demonstrated since October the 7th. I mean, the Americans have said to the Israelis lots of times, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And they've said it in public. And the Israelis have taken some notice behind the scenes, but then Netanyahu seems to have gone out of his way to insult President Biden, to actually show how little he cares about anything that Biden says. I mean, that would have been astonishing 20 years ago to see that spectacle.
And Alistair, all of this taking place, all of this tension building in the region, whilst those ceasefire negotiations continue with Hamas. I mean, what hope that those will ultimately now come to anything with this going on in the background and indeed the foreground?
Having been through rounds and rounds of ceasefire talks that have been ultimately unsuccessful in recent months, we hold little hope for this time. Let me try and look at the glass being half full, if you want. There are reports that both the Israelis and Hamas are now ready for a deal. So if those reports are true, well, that is encouraging. I think that the diplomatic pressure on Israel from Washington and other European allies is really intense this time. You notice the absence in statements of any kind of... they always used to say, we support Israel's right to defend itself. That has gone. And the reason that's gone is because I think there is a feeling now in Western capitals that Israel has achieved much in Gaza, and the impact on civilians has been so extreme that they're now choosing a different form of words. And also another reason to be maybe optimistic this time is that there are a few wins that Netanyahu could take and spin it in his favour, not least the killing of Ismail Haniyeh, which might not have complicated matters in the short term. But Hamas is for sure not the force it was. It can barely fire any missiles into Israel anymore. It is deteriorating in its command structure. Mohammed Daif, who was the head of the military wing, he was also assassinated in recent weeks. And so there is a lot of pressure on Hamas to do a deal. They have not gone away. They still are able to fight the Israelis. There was an Israeli soldier killed over the last 24 hours in southern Gaza. But Netanyahu, I think, could step away from it now, even only temporarily, and spin it as a bit of a victory. And he's being told by his security chiefs, the head of the IDF, the head of the Shin Bet intelligence agency, and the defense minister Yoav Gallant, he's being told by them it's time to take a deal.
Yeah, I mean, since the October the 7th attack, that was always the danger that this would rapidly slip into a more general Middle Eastern war for the elimination of the state of Israel. And that's undoubtedly what Hamas tried to provoke. Well, that hasn't happened. And I think the sense that, politically, Hamas has failed. They keep winning tactically because they keep persuading the Israelis to bomb schools and hospitals, and everybody in the Middle East hates the Israelis. So the fact that it hasn't slipped towards this more general war indicates that there are deeper dynamics that don't want it to happen. The Iranians are not ready for a general war to try to eliminate the state of Israel or even humiliate it. And so I think in a way, the outlook is for continued misery, continued conflict, but not this sort of more cataclysmic war across the Middle East. That was always a possibility and remains a possibility. We're closer to it now than we were a year ago. But that said, we're still not on the cusp of it. I'm hopefully glad to say.
Michael Clarke, Alistair Bunkall, thank you both very much indeed. And that's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll be back again tomorrow.